Prospero's Rite of Passage, The Magician's Tale. Part of the modern mythology of the Prospero Papers. Prologue. I have reached a point where everything is becoming more clear to me. I feel I can now commit to the use of the crudest, but perhaps the most intimate way of tracing for you my path, by putting pen to paper. It was my intention, as a part of becoming Prospero the Prognosticator, prospecting for awareness on the purgatorial island perched between life and death. A study had just revealed the huge transfer of energy, information, or data experienced by many dying beings at the moment of demise, revealing a precipitous perilous path of balance on a high wire between kinetic and potential energy that I have been able to share due to being able to attain a translational state of mind. Perhaps you will participate as I perambulate peripatetically and picaresquely along this passionate rite of passage. Come be with me, the poet, philosopher, writer, liar. It all started when I found myself not myself. Am I alive or dead? Awake or asleep? Chapter 1. It seemed like several lifetimes ago that I found myself sitting on the swing seat on the porch of my Midwest Whitewood slatted hopper-esque house veranda after just talking to Miranda and her holographic companion Jack. We'd been discussing our recent serendipitous discovery of the afterlife projector based on the capture of brainwave data just prior to or on the cusp of death. Perhaps the Now Life program would have better. What were revealed as quantum entanglement entropic communication lines arising from what I later discovered were the epiphanal translational state undecipherable I had ironically been trying to erase from the algorithm. I was on a high, a breakthrough had been made, a multitudinous multiverse of thoughts and images daydreamily raced through my mind. They saw the familiar glazed look in my eyes and took their leave. Farewell, Prospero, hey presto digitization. Miranda shouted to me as she got into her car and drove away. I was oblivious to the parting humorous salvo. Jack's image began to fade. My visitors had been gone for only what seemed like a few minutes when there was a sound of many cars and screeching brakes and sirens. I was startled from my elated reverie. Falling from the chair, I scrambled in a panic into the house when I saw a number of ominous figures charge toward me. Now I was in flight mode, so I crashed through the door, tripping as I did, knocking over the virtual image producer, plunging Jack's diminishing image to the depths of wherever it went when he was not holographically here. I kick-slammed the door behind me, staggered up, and attempted frantically to lock it. FBI. The door was unceremoniously smashed in with me still holding onto it, and I hit the ground, which knocked all the stuffing out of me. 3 uniformed SWAT men immediately pushed their way in, weapons in hand, and sat on my prone body, crushing what remained of the air from me. They lifted me to my feet and, smashing my face into the wall, one frisked me while the other 2 almost pulled my arms from their sockets. I screamed in pain, still gasping desperately for breath. "Shut up, you fucking terrorist," one of them shouted, pushing his substantial weapon into the back of my head. "You're under arrest for murder of Police Chief John Darwin." The cop grabbed my neck and read me my rights. They Mirandized me, I crazily thought. The odd comedic theatricality of the situation suddenly broke into my mind, and I laughed. The cops were not amused, confused maybe, and I was dragged unceremoniously back to my feet by the biggest, and the moment of insane hilarity passed with another body blow. "What you got to laugh about, you motherfucker?" The man was huge, spilling out of a badly fitting SWAT uniform. He was bestial and foreboding. My heart beat so hard I thought it would explode. Though I did not resist, one of the smaller men roughly yanked my hands behind my back and cuffed me. I was manhandled to a couple of local cops, men who I had known since childhood. "What's happening? Why are you doing this, Chuck?" He was rotund and pleasant-mannered normally, but not now. My uniformed old-school friend looked disdainfully at me. "You know very well, you son of a bitch," and he shoved me with his skinny arm like a sack of corn into the rear seat of a cop car, but not until he had given me a good smack across the back of the head with a baton. I did not come to for a while. When I did, I found myself alone in a small cell. I started to feel my body, which was a mass of pain, but it did not show in any way. Their extended beating had been very careful, done with some skill, I thought. I realized then that it was the end of the beginning for me, a period of amazing growth of awareness and adventure that had started when I decided to visit my dying father. Chapter 2. You've hardly visited me for the past 10 years, why come back now? He complained when he opened the door of his sheltered accommodation to me, as he always did. He was sat in a wheelchair with a drip feeding into his arm, looking up at me with a mixture of disdain and amusement. There was a glint in his eye that belied his illness. He was a lot thinner than when I saw him last month. The huge 6'3" soldier and sportsman shrunkenly reduced to a living skeleton. There was still a yellow mark on his smoking fingers, and the odor of cheap roll-up tobacco smoke on him was unmistakable. He saw my critical stare. "I'm nearly dead, what's the point of giving up the weed? You have no right to look so self-righteous." He shook his head as he spoke, much as he had when admonishing me as a kid. I smiled. "Ah, Dad, you know that's not true. At least I've been down at least every few months, not like Frank Jr. I had a brother who had not visited at all." I thought Dad's mind may be going, but the glint in his eye said otherwise. He knew who he was. "You only stay a few hours, you know it's lonesome without your mom. Your brother is too busy with high finance to visit, you know, otherwise he would have been down far more often." I could tell he was getting back to his normal grumpy old man self. "Aren't you going to invite me and Dad? It was a lovely autumn Virginia morning. Baby, it's cold outside," I intoned. It was his turn to smile, he did so broadly. He dexterously reversed his wheelchair while at the same time maneuvering the drip trolley carefully, and gestured me in with a flourish of his arm that nearly pulled out the catheter. He winced and I laughed. "Have a care for your old man," he laughed raspingly and smacked me weakly on the ass as I walked past him, ushering me into the small residence, which was spotlessly clean. He was right about the brevity of my visits, which I felt guilty about. "Are you still doing that madman magic stuff on TV?" he asked. "I'm thinking about quitting, Dad." "I bet it's something to do with that woman of yours," he said, tuning into my thoughts. I turned back and looked inquiringly at him. "I warned you about her. I told she was a gold digger, but you wouldn't listen. Mr. Smart Arse you are." I shrugged. He was right. He knew all along, but I thought I was in love and I couldn't listen. "She cleaned me out, Pop. She's got really good lawyers behind her, and I thought I could do it on my own." "Yeah, I saw it in the papers. We still have them here, you know." "I wouldn't trust that internet news of yours anyway." He was trying to make light of the whole thing for me. "Don't be so bitter, son. It's good that you're here. You can maybe think about making a new start. Do something with your education. You are a doctor after all. I was always proud of your PhD. How you got to be a magician after being a neuroscientist, I'll never fathom." He had never admitted to being proud before. Maybe things were changing for the better. I certainly felt better. "I told you, Dad, that it's all to do with the ability to create holographs using the brain. It's easier to make the holograph appear and disappear than anything real, because it's not there in the first place." I gestured. "There's loads more money in magic too, especially when you create magical scenes from history." "But that's history now trying to make light of it." I tried to explain about Emily and her influence. "It's all about how we interpret the world we live in, Dad. A poet, Emily Dickinson, said it often and better than me. We see the world in words, but she saw past this into the it, or as we might call it, IT. I quoted her words that had stunned me with her amazing, insightful intuition, filtered by my creative IT brain. "A word is dead when it is said." Some say. I say it, it just begins to live. That day. That's as clear as mud to me, son. He winked and smiled, appreciating my attempts to open my weird world to him. As we talked in the hallway, he smacked me playfully again and pointed to the small dining room. I grimaced for a second, as this time it reminded me of not-so-playful smacks that I had from him when he was the worse for drink. But he had given up many a year ago, and though memories were painful, I knew his upbringing in a hard-drinking Irish family had left him with many scars. We had shared many an evening since I got back in contact with him a few years back and talked it through. "Let's have a cup of coffee, son. You know my mind goes blank when you start getting all smart-arse technical on me." We walked into the room, and the first thing that caught my eye was the huge illustration of the Battle of Fredericksburg that had been on our lounge wall at home and was now here. The impact it had on my imagination was always a shock to me. I felt myself momentarily morphed into a soldier going to the slaughter. "Is it okay if I stay a few days, Dad? I can sleep on the sofa," I asked as we sat in his parlor, after giving him the rundown of my recent divorce debacle. "Sure, son, as long as you don't snore too loud." The next morning I took Dad for a tour of the town in his electric wheelchair, or rather he took me. His nurse had come in at an early hour and helped him dress himself in an immaculate white suit and a fedora. The nurse nodded sagely as she left. She knew him well. "Take care, old soldier. See you later." "It's nice to see you, Prospero. Your visits always cheer him up." My father was now like an old cotton plantation owner surveying his estate as we moved around the town. That's where the Confederates shot a whole squad of pillagers after the battle. They had been hiding in that church. The firing squad was Irish, and those they killed were New York Irish. They were following Stonewall Jackson's orders, because when he was asked what should be done with them, he had said, kill 'em all." He seemed to know many small details that didn't appear in history books. It was like he had some source unavailable to the academics. As we went about the town as directed by my dad, we met no one on foot, though many a car would sound their horn and wave, and many a "Hi Frank, how's it going?" greeting would be made by people from their rocking chair verandas. After some time, when we were near the railway station, a cop car came up and drew up alongside us. We stopped. "How's it going, guys?" The window wound down and a smiling face looked out on them. "Hi, Chuck," I said, recognizing him immediately. "Dad, this is Chuck. I was at high school with him. Remember, he was quarterback on the team." The rotund, cuddly cop nodded at my dad. Chuck looked at me with interest. "I like your TV seance show spectaculars," he said. "My kids and wife would love to see one. Any chance of some tickets?" He said conspiratorially. Before I could answer, my dad piped up. "I wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire," he spat. "I remember you, Chuck. Yeah, I remember you well," Dad said in a voice tinged with deep wrath. "Wasn't it you and your pals who put Frank Jr. in the Mary Washington Hospital that time?" I glanced at Dad and remembered the beating they had given him. It was dangerous to be gay in a town like this. "Yeah, I guess I'd forgotten that," I said, and looked balefully at the cop, who had stopped smiling as soon as Dad spoke and turned and grunted to his partner with a thumb point over his shoulder at us. "Weirdos," he said just loud enough for us to hear. His partner, who I also knew, looked across and nodded. The cop said clearly, "He got what he deserved, queer fucker. You watch that tongue of yours, old man. It may get you into trouble one day." With a cynical nod to his partner, he wound up the window and drove away. "You didn't have to be so short with the guy," I said, always the diplomat. "He's a complete jerk-off, and you know it," I thought for a while and said. "Yeah, I guess he was one of the most arrogant sons of bitches at school." "That's right, he and his gang nearly killed Frank Jr. That punk only came over to talk to you 'cause you're a famous star on the TV now. Most regular people in this town know to leave you alone when you're home." I nodded, and we tried to shake off this encounter by breathing in the fresh autumnal New World Symphony air. Chapter 3. The city was beautiful in the bronzed leaf fall weather. The flowers were multicolored, the lawns vivid green and carpet-like, the houses pastel-shaded, wooden slatted, raised high on verandas like old southern mansions on a small scale. Even the shabbier ones looked quaint and attractive. We would call in and chat to the people Dad knew, and he knew a lot. So it took us at least 2 or 3 hours to complete what should have been a half-hour walk. We soon forgot Chuck. Dad stopped me by a larger residence where an old lady dressed in elegant southern dress, straight out of Gone with the Wind, stood and shouted a greeting. "That's Nanny Haskins," he said, waving back. Her ancestor was a famous Civil War nurse. She waved to us with all her ancient willow wand of a body. There was something more going on there, I thought. Dad had a reputation, as did I, for being a philanderer, and did not deny it. Dad tipped his equally elegant white fedora to her in a way that I found intriguing. We walked up to her place and she came down the steps with a delicate assurance. She was some years younger than my dad. "Good day, young men," she said, and Dad doffed his fedora again, and I, without thinking, bowed at the hips. She acknowledged each of us with an elegant nod. "Hi, Nanny, you know who this is?" She nodded. "You're the great Prospero, aren't you?" The name used here embarrassed me, theatrical as it was. Everyone knew me by my magic name. "Yes, that's me. Hi, Mississippi." She looked me over carefully. "You take after your mother, you know." You have her eyes and the look of an old plantation-owning gentleman. I was flattered. "Not like this Joshua Chamberlain mustachioed Bowery boy," Dad smiled shyly. "I used to be a student of your mother's, you know. She was one of the first woman history professors at the university. Boy, was she good, knew history so well she could teach it to us like we were there. Everyone went to her lectures, even those who were not learning history. It was a shame she died so young. She was a great loss to us all." She spoke with a sadness that I could sympathize deeply with. "It's a pity she was buried so far away," she said. Dad nodded. "That was her father. He wanted her to buried in the family plot." You could hear the hackles rising. This was an old, still open wound. Nanny realized that she had ventured too far. "I'm sorry, Frank. Don't get riled. I know how much you miss having her around." He looked abashed. This woman calmed him in a way that Mom had. There was obviously more going on between these two than friendship. "I think you two had better go now. I need my beauty sleep." She came over and kissed Dad on the cheek, whispering something in his ear as she did so, and shook my hand. "It's good to see you, Prospero. Your dad values your visits more than you realize." Dad doffed his hat again and left. We continued our perambulation. "You seem to be quite close to Nanny." He ignored me and drove on, pointing out various war sites that none but he knew about. My suspicions were, I was sure, not groundless. He had spoken to me of what he called his wicked ways on a previous visit. "I was not good to your mom, son." I had a wandering eye, and when I had a few inside me I wouldn't hesitate, given the chance. He was a good-looking hunk of a man when he was young, so I wasn't surprised by this. I also felt prone to being wayward, but because I didn't drink, and I was no way near as good-looking as my dad, it was only rarely that I attempted to carry through with my prick-driven fantasies despite many fan-base opportunities. I never really noticed it when we was young. Mom, who had married beneath her station, never made any comment except on the rare binge-drinking occasions when she caught him beating on us. "Frank," she would say, "I know why, you know why, don't do it. Away with you." Dad would turn like a wild animal caught in a headlight and slink away to sleep it off. He never raised a hand to her even when he was drunk. It was as if she had some kind of deep control over him, for barroom brawls were not unfamiliar to him. It was tragic when she died so young, carried away by cancer. It was when she had gone he became far more violent to us, which abated over the years as he became used to his loss, it seemed. This was now water under the bridge for me. I understood and forgave. We eventually arrived at our destination, the Sunken Road Tourist Center. "Up and at 'em," he shouted, pretending to be a soldier from a Bowery boy battalion rushing up the hill to the Sunken Road. We had always done this when we were kids, Dad, me, and Frank Jr., at weekends, rushing up the hill with us falling over after being shot by the Six Nation men who haunted the wall above us. He started up the steep part of the hill at the highest speed the chair could reach. He sat in the chair like a kid in a pushchair trying to make the thing go up this slope. But it could not make it. "Shit, son, give me a push." this dang machine won't make it. He was right. It started going backwards. I rushed up and took the handles. Faster, faster, you son of a bitch, he shouted. Faster, he exhorted, and I had to push him and the heavy chair hard up the steeper slope. I was wheezing hard, trying to catch my breath, and I was fit. My magic shows required a lot of physical effort, which I employed a personal trainer for. Clearly his fascination with the Civil War had not dimmed over the years. It may have deepened in intensity. I wondered why. It was a blessing when we got up the hill to the gift shop cum museum. I stood catching my breath. Dad managed to get the wheelchair in motion and propel himself inside, where he manipulated the chair skillfully around the knickknacks and battlefield paraphernalia that sat in a junk shop way around the place. The owner was an antique of a local man who had made another sort of killing from the battle when he astutely bought this small part of history for tourist purposes. I followed Dad in when I had recovered and saw him turn to the owner, who had just come from a back room. "Hi, Lee," he said in a mock southern drawl, and this did not amuse the proprietor, with his precarious ginger mop of a wig wobbling, in the least. "Frank, I told you not to use that tone with me." Dad winked at me and did some more. "What happened at that remote courthouse?" The man cringed in sullen disbelief. "You know, Frank, that's where the rebels in gray finally surrendered," Lee said with a sigh. "Why do you always bring this up, you northern blue scum?" Lee jestingly said. My dad replied, "Because it's always worth it." The man was fully aware of Dad's Irish humor and played along with the obviously well-worn script and just said, "Fuck you northern scum, get out." As we passed over the threshold, he held the door and spoke with a smile of affection in his voice. "See you tomorrow, Frank. Sorry about your wife, Prospero." "You two have a good day." I grimaced a bit, and we left. Across the road from the museum was the beginning of the preserved sunken road, the stone wall, from which so much death was dealt from on that day in 1862, still pockmarked by bullet and shell holes from the Civil War battle. We went slowly over to the carefully tended memorial and felt the atmosphere sink into us, feeling the eerie silences that often descended here. Even the trees seemed to stop breathing. "Listen," Dad would say. "That silence is the sound of the gunfire and deaths of 20,000 men and boys." They never counted the civilians who died in the street fighting. Dad had brought me here often as a child and described the history so well I could always picture battle scene as if I was there. I could hear his voice as if commentating live. The Union troops marched up the hill as if they were on parade, across the old fairground with no protection at all. They came on up Mary's Heights, and their bodies were ripped apart by the cannon balls and horribly mutilated by the soft lead bullets of the rag-bag Confederate Georgian farm boys who stood in ranks sheltered behind the wall of the sunken road. Son, Lee and his generals had known of the Federal Army's Major General Burnside's approach for over a week, as he had to wait for pontoon bridges to arrive to cross the Rappahannock. Just along there 3,000 gray-uniformed Southern farm boys stood rank upon rank in their strong position, not believing the stupidity of the Union Army generals as they ordered the blue-uniformed Northern farm boys to attack. The Grays could not help but slaughter their kinsfolk from Newton City, cheering drunkenly their equally inebriated Northern brethren bravery as their rifle fire felled line upon line of the blue-uniformed enemy. It was Southern Army's first great victory in the war, made his reputation. Dad shook his head, and it was all based on the rank stupidity of a general's trying to impress the Northern president with his attack-mindedness. I glanced over to the wall just yards away. The road alongside which the wall is built is now part of a tourist pathway. This passes through a beautifully manicured Midwest park with grass and trees rooted in the fertile bone meal of the battlefield abattoir. The park contains a 100-meter chunk of the sunken road and protecting wall together with shell-holed cottage that is still standing from the date of the battle. Above the path wound up Mary's Heights, which gave panorama of the field, and here is situated the well-tended battle graveyard and a couple of 2-century-old iron cannon permanently posing for the cameras. "It's getting hot, Dad, let's move on." The autumnal sun was reaching its zenith. We went down from the memorial and into the tourist center, where Dad exchanged pleasantries with the volunteer tour guides. They knew Dad and were clearly intimidated by this expert in their midst. They were perfectly aware Dad knew far more than them about the battle. "Hello, Frank," the eldest guy said in a drawl. "It's nice to see you again. Have you dug up any new information recently?" The guy, who was dressed in tweeds, asked. "Yes, I have actually, Professor. I'll get back to you when it's fully documented." I could see the two men look askance at one another. "As you wish, Frank. We'll just look around for a bit if that's okay, Prof?" The tweed man nodded. There was a huge circular 3D model in the middle of the room which showed the extended front, which was several miles long. We looked at this for a while and some of the exhibits as well. "I'm getting hungry, son," Dad said. "Let's go eat." The men looked relieved and ushered us out enthusiastically. "See you later, Professor," Dad remarked. "I'll bring the new stuff over when I've cross-checked some other sources." He's an emeritus professor in history up at Mary's University, another one of your mom's students. I clearly could see the pride in his eyes and hear it in his voice as he continued. He's written a couple of books about the battle, mostly based on interviews with me. I'm never cited, though. He seemed amused by the subservience of these academics, who I knew from college days. He did not have much truck with us. He knew the ins and outs from our mom. We went over a small road to a row of trees. Benches were set by the trees between the tour center, the shop, and the inevitable car park. There were more people walking here than I had seen all morning. In front of the benches, a 12 feet by 8 foot notice board cum hoarding stood. It had a large map of the site, some description of the battle, and a large contemporary image of the battle was prominently displayed. I knew this picture well, as it always been on the lounge wall, and now adorned the dining room wall of his new home. We sat on one of the benches to eat our lunch. We've got a packed lunch of cold chicken and salad, with a thermos of the hot, thick black coffee, just as you like it, Dad. I knew he would want to consume this southern feast here. It was a scene that again drew me back to my childhood. When I was young, I sat on this same bench, and when the sun was high, I saw their faces on a tree trunk. Look, Frank Jr., can you see the soldiers' faces? A few small circular images had formed on the tree trunks as the dappled light shone through the leaves of the trees. Yeah, bro, I see 'em. Them trees is haunted by the souls of the rotten bodies of the blues, these trees whose roots delve deep into the mass graves of the many who died. Dad, are the trees haunted? I asked. Dad looked at the contorted shapes on the trees as they appeared and disappeared with the random movement of the light through the leaves. It's a dance of death, son. He continued, a dance of bad death. What's a bad death, Dad? It's when the living relatives can't say goodbye to their loved one, son. He made a sweeping gesture with his arm. All the guys killed here were either buried in huge pits where they fell or in mass graves up on the hill there. There are no graves that their relatives can visit and say goodbye to their dead loved one. They can't go and see their lost relatives like we do with Mom? That's right, son. There's at best a cross with the regiment's name for 5 to 20 buried. That's up in the cemetery. Only a few hundred of the thousands killed are up there. The rest are under our feet. I could see the faces in the trees in a new light. I was sure they were talking. Dad's present voice interjected and brought me back to the here and now from my childhood reverie. I was still looking at the projected faces 40 years later. Dad looked at me, knowing what was going through my mind. This is where my great-grandfather and your great-great-grandfather Frank fought and was nearly killed. Dad suddenly announced. I hadn't heard about this before. I was taken aback. Why the hell haven't you mentioned it before, Dad? It's because I only found out the other day, 2 days ago to be exact. How did that happen? Well, you know the old gal we talked to earlier this morning. My curiosity was now well piqued. Yeah, Nanny Gaskins or something. Haskins, don't you ever listen? Yeah, okay, whatever, go on. Well, I have got to know her quite well recently. I remembered the suspicions the conversation had aroused in me. Yes, I understand. You don't have to stand on ceremony with me, Dad. He was playing me like a fish, and enjoying it. I was itching to know what he had found out about our New York ancestry, most of which I knew of was unsavory to say the least. Go on, Dad, please. Well, as I said, her great-grandmother was a nurse right here, and she tended the Yankees as well as the Confederates. Yes, go on. Well, it turns out that she kept a diary with her most intimate secrets in it, and one of them was a dalliance she had with a northerner from Newton City, a poor pauper lad. What? I exclaimed. He looked gleefully at me. To be honest, me and Nanny been good friends for many years. I could tell there was something going on between you two. Really, he said, trying to sound innocent, still playing the bait in front of me. Stop fucking around, Dad. Spill the beans. Well, come on. The diary came to light when Nanny was cleaning out her attic the other day. It had his name and his address in the Bowery in New York, his real name and address, that is. He signed up under a bogus name because he was on the run from the law. I held my breath. This was edge-of-the-seat stuff. She also had his false name as well, so I was able to look up his record in the war. What a small world, I remarked, and Dad continued. She was called Nanny too, and he was called Frank. This was unbelievable, I gawped. Nanny called me straight away when she had read it and came round, and she showed me the diary. She was overcome with emotion and lust. Dad, I'm not interested in the sex, just the war. I was gaining some composure now. I copied out all the days relating to her hunky Irishman and his nurse. It turned out that she kept him hid until he was ready to travel. He made it back to the Union lines with no problem. And he was playing it for all it was worth. I could see where my entertainment gene had come from. He was with the Union Army for the rest of the war, and survived all the carnage of Grant's campaign against Lee, and was actually at Appomattox Courthouse when the surrender was signed. He was promoted to an officer too. That explains his disappearance for all those years. I said. No trace of great-grandfather Frank could be found in the records post-1861, though the fortunes of my Bowery House ancestors had improved during these years, with them ending up living in the 1890s in Washington Square. We had thought he may have died in the war or in a street brawl, both equally likely possibilities. But this was something else. Come on, Dad, there more, isn't there? He smiled, playing me again. Cheeky old bugger, get on with it. The liaison between Nanny and Frank did not stop after the war. He came back and stayed with Nanny. No, you two don't have the same great-grandfather, do you? You guessed it. It's not incest, is it, you two? I don't know, and I don't care. We didn't know about our relationship until the other day. He continued, smiling mischievously. You don't think I'm still at it, do you? I wouldn't out it past you, you dirty old man. He loved it and giggled as he picked up and munched noisily on a sandwich. By the way, Dad, I've decided to move back here for a while. It was his turn to be surprised. He stopped munching and looked over at me. I thought I detected a tear in his eye. I certainly had one in mine. The media will find out though, Dad, and I will have to leave you alone for a while. He could see I was troubled about my neglect of him. Don't worry, son. I'm looking forward to meeting your mother again. He smiled. I'm never really alone, you know, and I kind of did. I got up and hugged him. He shrugged me off. Then, in an attempt I knew to change the subject, he retold me a story about his favorite Confederate general. Do you remember Stonewall had said when asked by one of his Confederate officers what could be done about the pillagers, kill them all. That seemed to be a feeling that pervaded many in the western lands today too. A tear came to my eye. Dad knew about my feeling for this place, and for the futility of violent death and mutilation, and touched my shoulder as I sobbed silently for a minute or so, lost in grief. I wept at the eternal recurrence that echoed through history, all those who have violently died bad deaths, and were lost despite their sacrifice. Kill them all. Kill them all, I recited, and Dad started to weep too. We were in the same dreadful valley of death. We wept not just for the 15,000 Northerners and 3,000 Confederates perished and now lay under the housing that covered the old fairground and up on Cemetery Ridge. We wept for the civilians who died in the first place to witness street-to-street, door-to-door combat. We wept for all those who had shed their blood and were still doing so. The blood of violence was everywhere. Dad had said that one of his favorite writers, Shelby Foote, had said that you could get a Ph.D. by working out the number of handkerchiefs it would take to soak up the blood spilled in the Civil War. Dad said that this was based on some stupid senator's assertion early in the war that only one would be needed to do this. Stupid senator, I interjected. Things haven't changed much, have they? He nodded wearily, resignedly. I could thus, since I was a child, see the slaughter, feel the pain and the vainglory of men in battle. I think it was this touch with the devastating mortality of battle that gave me a taste for things mystical and scientific. I was looking for answers. Perhaps where there were none, but it didn't stop me trying to find them. Chapter 4. It was thus I became interested in models of how the mind worked. Why people would do such things to each other fascinated me. I excelled at mathematics at school and easily gained a scholarship to Harvard, where computer science was a nascent subject, and got in as it were on the ground floor of the nascent subject of neuroscience, using computers to model the brain. But when I was at college, I became involved with more mystical ideas as well. I had always had an interest in literature, and this blossomed when at college, as most of my girlfriends turned out to be literature students, who I went out with because their minds were full of ideas that expanded my vision, my desire to live in a world of the real and the imaginary which was dynamic and ever-expanding. Poetry, I saw, had this kind of feel to it and sought out those who embraced it. One of my earliest girlfriends introduced me to Emily Dickinson. You will like her, she said. She's a loner with an unbelievable imagination and brain, just like you. Of course, my vanity and my curiosity were stimulated by her sexy whispered in my earbed words. And Pamela, or Pam, I think her name was not wrong. For Emily became my very favorite for some time because her poetry contained all sorts of imagery that I could relate to, from truthful looks of agony to swinging arcs of light that reminded me of multi-hued galaxies gyrating endlessly through space-time. I had an intense interest in quantum mechanics and quantum field theory from an early age too, and found the equations of Schrödinger and Dirac and their academic descendants that others found hard to harness, easy to come to terms with. Thus the unsettled, probabilistic nature of the universe was opened up to me, a place of yin and yang, of potential and kinetic energy, their interleaving and interweaving, creating an oddly settled idea of a totally interconnected universe underlying all. I tried to explain to Pam as she massaged me using her reflective reflexology skills. Solving these equations is a kind of mystical event for me. Each time I do it, I have the feeling I was intensifying my quantum link with everything and everybody, seeing through the numbing numbers to something that actually mattered. What this was I was not sure, but that did not dispel the wonderful weirdness of belonging that rendered the multiverse transparently invisible, and myself vividly transparent at the same time. It was a feeling aroused, rather like the touch of her soothing massaging hands, of complete cathartic cauterization, cleansing, renewing. I know I don't need to know. She stopped and sat back, looking with a transparency that seemed to match mine. I continued, inspired by our closeness in that moment. I feel in that place of superposition, immersed in doubt and uncertainty, with no irritable reaching after fact and reason, this translational state. A place where it was enough just to be. Pam listened to me attentively until she could see I was finished. You are not like the other science students I know. You have opened new vistas for me too. I now see things in a different light. She had studied Shakespeare extensively. She spoke of her favorite play. The Tempest is the best. I hadn't properly understood it until I met you, I think. She was enjoying this. Prospero, the main character, is so much like you, she laughed, knowing my interest was piqued. It's full of conjurer's magic based on book learning. Shakespeare had a man in mind, I think, a guy, again like you, a mystical polymath called John D. He was a spy master, scholar, a polyglot mathematician, and all-round genius. She was warming to her subject, her eyes gleaming. His book on Euclid includes references to the use of science and the written word combined with new technologies like pneumatic power, springs, and levers to befuddle ignorant, illiterate, and not so illiterate audiences. He called this thaumaturgy, which was Greek for wonder-working. He would have loved your ideas. As do I. That's great, Pam. You have massaged my mind as well as my feet. It feels fantastic. Pam was obviously flattered and said she would help me look into thaumaturgy, which I did with alacrity. I was taken by the multi-theistic nature of the thaumaturgic tradition. I had problems with my traditional Christian upbringing, brought about, I supposed, by my exposure to the blind faith of so many dying so fruitlessly on the religious battlefields of history, combined with a skeptical quantum physics insight. It gave me a feeling of isolation that D had undergone too. He noted the reaction to his experimentation in the elements. And for these, and such like marvelous acts and feats, naturally and mechanically, wrought and contrived, ought any honest student and modest Christian philosopher be counted and called a conjurer? Shall the folly of idiots and the malice of the scornful so much prevail? Shall that man be, in hugger-mugger, condemned as a companion of the hellhounds, and a caller and conjurer of wicked and damned spirits? I talked this feeling of remoteness through with Pam, whose insightful comments opened this new perspective to me with a tsunami power. All the major religions have a relationship with mysticism. She spoke with an oracular clearness that captivated me. Another person I associate with the study of thaumaturgy was one of my favorite philosophers, Jacques Derrida. He talks of philosophy as being a sort of thaumaturgy in his book The Gift of Death. I was in awe of this woman, a little intimidated maybe. Thus, together with my studies of D's thaumaturgy and the triumvirate of D's, Derrida, Dirac, and Dickinson had conspired between them in my mind, which sealed my relationship with spacetime. It was just up to us to work out what to do with this information energy opportunity, or as I saw it, an infinite source of new beginnings and eternal renaissance of thought and invention. It was then, in a state of amazing waking and dreaming, kinetic and potential intellectual flux, that I started sharing dreamtime with Emily. Traveling with her persuasive penetralium of not just verse, but polychromatic multiverse of wordlessness, it goes without saying, I cannot say, I only sigh. I was in love with a woman for the first time. Pam did not seem to understand this strangeness that had overcome me, for I didn't try to explain as I was embarrassed, and we drifted apart. It was the beginning of the development of the emergence of myself into a translational status, embracing the dust-to-dust discovering of Keatsian negative capability, which Pam had introduced to me too. It was a waking precursor, a nativity to a nebulous nascent nursery of ideas where a dreamy holographic production program would come to me. What I saw and was able enrapturedly capture were the neuroscientific specifications of a reverse eyepiece hardware that would allow the projection of quantumly produced interference patterns in the mind, by unredecohering them. Using collapsed observables which acted like polarized individual frames in a movie, and by gathering sufficient polarization events, a depolarization of sorts emerged which enabled the production of a virtual pseudo-coherent holographic image. I was using decoherence to overcome decoherence. It was her I saw as the guide to these opening in the dream interpenetrated. It was her nonsense ability to see through all the lies that enabled me to see through the curtain of falsehoods to a falsifiable virtual freedom. I was eventually able to date Emily in her dreams, for she was her own mistress, even though she called me her master. I always suspected this appellation was in deep jest. She knew I was her slave. Emily even wrote waking letters to me, her master, that confused the hell out of her blinkered money-grabbing biographers and aimlessly ambitious academic archivists. She pointed out our relationship and her involvement in our joint project quite often and quite clearly. It is again evident her wordless waking writing, evoking our remembrance battlefield garden dreamtime trysts, where death and the infinite went hand in glove with our love. As by the dead we love to sit, become so wondrous dear. As for the lost we grapple, though all the rest are here. In broken mathematics, we estimate our prize, vast in its fading ratio, to our penurious eyes. But it was still only a dreamtime projection device made of my broken mathematics, the imagery convincing but penurious, of little substance, so I sought to make use of it as best I could. The career I chose to follow was then in theatrical magic, an anarchic kind of response to the deep insights stimulated by a devil-may-care John Dee-like rebellious fame-seeking streak. My career reached a pinnacle when my magic became an internet and TV phenomenon, with billions of followers worldwide. I became fabulously rich and completely disillusioned, for there was surely more to this than just being followed by a herd of money-grabbing people disguised as organizations desperate to share in the monetary rewards. The reason for my success was mostly down to my wife, who I had met on one of my first forays into the world of TV. Victoria was a media animal, and with her silicon breasts and mind, and, much to Emily's chagrin, I fell under this woman's spell, and the cash rolled in. But she had no depth whatsoever, and so she never tainted to any real extent my relationship with Emily. When she realized that I was no longer her cash cow, she left me. I had to get away, and I still had the money to do it. I thus built a haven in the Badlands far from civilization where I would escape to from time to time. Emily laughed at me. Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. She had laughed even harder when my gold-digger wife cleaned me out, but I was able to retain my remote retreat home, and after spending time for a while with my father before the press intrusions drove me into isolation. Chapter 5. It was while staying in my remote isolated retreat, in the deeply dented seasoned sculpted steppe of the outback, I started to get profoundly concerned about my father's health. I felt guilty about leaving him to cope with the media, but felt I had no option. Emily warned me, but again I did not listen. He then became reclusive, even my dreamtime communications with him were sparse. I was unable to contact my dreaming or waking father. Even Emily was unable to elicit anything from him, and they had always been close. It was thus a shock when I heard of his death. He hadn't spoken of it in the dreamtime, I think because he was in a very real sense looking forward to it. The actuality of his death something I found difficult to comprehend, and it engendered in me a crisis of what you may call my faith in things. I pondered often upon our time together, trying to piece myself together again. He had often commented on my career I chose to follow, and was convinced that theatrical magic was a false kind of response to the deep insights I had as a child. It was not until I had fully grasped the art of illusion via the utilization of Emily's dreamtime-driven holographic magic and heard of my father's waking departure that I realized that was what the theatrical world was about, delusional illusion. I was fooling myself as well as my audiences. I couldn't do it anymore, good though I was, with my own TV show and massive spectaculars and online reality specials that earned me hundreds of millions of dollars that my ex-wife was now entitled to. So I had a financial as well as intellectual motive to move on. My waking life seemed empty, the success and all that went with it was as false and illusory as my great Prospero magic. This was when I decided to give the theatrical approach up. I needed to investigate the phenomena on a more intimate level, that much was clear to me. This slowly sparked a non-ephemeral epiphany, if there is such a thing. It could be said to have begun when I came back to attend my father's funeral, which was to be in the city where I grew up. I was prompted by a dream to visit our childhood slaughterhouse of soldiers. I thus found myself in the waking world, sat again in the battlefield by the marching sour apple trees, searching for sleeping solutions. The bomb-like explosive bangs of the falling fruit thrown by the squirrels high in the trees echoed fearfully like shells bursting in my mind. The renewing spring sun shining through the leaves projected shadows onto the gnarled trunks and revealing circular halos of light wherein were exposed tortured faces, contorted in agonies of Lord knows what wounds, crying out the heedless world. Except I wasn't heedless. I heard the voices, mixed and jumbled though they may be to the ear of a waking being. They were deciphered in my dreams and came fresh to me in the morning when I woke, telling me of their lives. Pop was never comfortable with my empathy for the gray as well as the blue, and we were never close until his illness became grave. I could hear Emily's dreamy voice too, her penetralium of aware despair at the dreadful death toll being taken in the name of a middle-aged white man god that she had little or no time for. They could then show me on a widescreen of dream awareness, not the tragedy of their useless deaths, but the more personal tales of their families and the loss of a life not lived, but not wasted. It was as if these entangled voices were telling me of the value of life lying in its intimate connection with death, joined not separated. They were all insistent on this point, although the different shades of meaning were evident in the different lives that were and which could never be cancelled. With Emily's alabaster chamber of maiden thought insightful input, I was able to see that each life and death contributed irrevocably, unrestrainedly, and wonderfully to the very fabric of the universe. It was because of such insights that I returned to my hometown and started my seance business. Rather than avoiding the media, I embraced them. My ex-wife had recently remarried a hugely rich Silicon Valley moronic messiah, was now very much a background figure who I could ignore, and did. My dream awareness had indicated this path to me. I woke one morning just after a seeming dream about an old TV spectacular where I had been talking to the holographic ghosts of past presidents, and in particular to Abe Lincoln. The show had started, as ever with my catchphrase. Hey presto, digitization, a pathetic pun on prestidigitation. The show had then continued with a gradual fade to the Gettysburg Battlefield address and then an interview with him to get his superficial populist, pre-programmed opinions on the current world situation. It was not the hologram talking, but the distinctly artificial voice box I had devised. I had guidance, if you could call my dream awareness such. But the whole spectacular was still an illusion created for the bogus world of the media, and its mind-shredding mediocrity was perhaps the main reason I decided to turn away from the mass mind mutilation that was entertainment. It was this coupled to inputs from my newly and seemingly happily dead dad and Emily that guided threadbare movement of my mind. An attempt to get back to my own roots from whence the public Prospero persona had dendritically and uncontrollably hogweed sprouted, to find a more striated warp and wolf thinking process. In order to avoid the trolls and stalkers that were the inevitable result of my fame, I adopted a nomadic existence, living from place to place, sometimes in mobile homes, sometimes motels, oftentimes staying with the bereaved ones who I was helping. I returned to my father's home at rare intervals to recharge my batteries. My first attempts at seance were, due to my so-called Dreamtime spirit guides, amongst them the 4Ds my dead dad and Emily, quite successful. It was not because of any connection I made with the bereaved people's loved ones in the Dreamtime, but because my clients had actually shared their lives and breathed the same air, and so some of their brains were actually made of stuff that was physically connected to the other person. It was this sharing the air interactive quantum field particle creation stream I plugged into. The interactions also took place in the homes of the bereaved, as this added to the personal as well as the particular atmosphere of the sessions. This was another dream insight I had had. I managed to make the clients aware of this connection both environmentally and spiritually during the seance by means of enhanced home-centered illusions, which, largely baseless though they were, gave an insight into non-fearful vitrolic death that few people had nowadays. It was a case for most of everybody wanting to go to heaven, but nobody wanting to die. The idea of death as a return to a wholeness and oneness with the universe is not new, but I was able to create holographic images of pre- and post-life experiences of my clients that had melded into their living waking existences, using the interference properties of quantum mechanics inherent in the holographic process. It was via a special Dreamtime program I had written that picked up on the quantum connections in the brain, the interference patterns of memory, if you will. I fed said information to the clients in a dream state when they had access to an internal holographic multiversal communication web which gave them some of the Dreamtime insight I had always had. It created a feedback loop which enabled them to access this multiversal quantum connection when they were awake. This connection allowed them in a very real sense to connect to the information that about their loved one they had always possessed but been unable to access when awake. They were able to create interference patterns of the dearly departed within their own neural networks by meditation of a sort, which were able to be modeled by my program and thus projected as holographs into the theatrically lit seance room where we sat, hand in hand. I had gained access to this program when I was lucid dreaming, where increased awareness was available to me, and I was able to see the demise of humanity due to its illusory self-destructive nature, and act as a guru and a sort of archivist for our species, laying trails of remembrance in the quantum information web so that our race would not be lost as a part of the multiversal imagination. In such dreams, I was always given the impression that to attempt to interfere with this process would only accelerate it. It was something that I was impatient to do, but if I did not heed the interference patterns and the delicate balance of the potential and kinetic energy of dynamic wave equilibrium of which the fabric of the multiverse was woven, I could condemn humanity to a complete schism formed the memory of the multiverse. It was indicated when I woke each morning that I was simply not able to walk such a tightrope as yet. To get back to the seances, I could outline my feelings on these occasions as follows. The room was cold and misty. Frozen coat too will do that. I often wondered how the customers didn't notice. Dry ice for the visitors to cool the ardor for their lost ones. The convention requires that I show an example. Perhaps you may find the scene more convincing if I do so. Those around the table were often people I knew from the local community. I had acquired a notoriety locally because of my frequent visits to the sunken wall and its environs. I also had the habit of filming the trees to gain scientific credence for my speculative theories on life and death. Because people did not understand, they attached to me a label of medicine man, shaman, or druid due to my Tree of Dead communication project. This kind of stuff was as ever extremely popular with many who infest the web, and my work thus became viral fodder for more millions. I also gained additional publicity from the many TV stations that included my studies as a matter of habit in their pseudo-parapsychological programming. Though I insisted what I did was entirely speculative, their presentations always took the route that higher ratings would provide, the famous ex-magician in search of a universal truth. The religious networks would also use my work to support their absolutist notions, which were entirely antithetical to me. I was now ironically making more money than before, because of the publicity loop I had been inducted into made all my publications sell in huge numbers, in many different languages. It was so then that often relatives of the victims of violent deaths, many different persuasions, would come into contact with me. Those whose close kin had been killed in uncertain combat or other suspicious ways in general came to me for solace. For these consultations I would charge whatever I thought that client could afford. Often I did them for nothing. The most pivotal occasion was with my dad's hometown police chief and his wife. They were suggested as clients by my father, who had known the mother wanted to contact her son, who now lying in the Arlington National Cemetery. Captain John and Miranda Darwin was their name. The only son, John J.N.R., known as Jack by the family, had been killed in combat in an unnamed war zone, a bad death by all accounts. The wife was, I noticed, a very attractive younger woman who, as I found most women were, more open and aware to life's possibilities. Emily was amused by my idiocy. There was a problem with the equipment that night. An electrical storm was in full force outside. We sat around a round table in a very seance-like scene, and I started the equipment. The mother was already connected remotely to the dream stimulator/simulator, and I connected myself to the eyepiece monitor/controller. We then all held hands. Miranda Darwin fell into the dream awareness leitmotif easily and could feel her oneness with her son, with whom she was still entangled within and without in a quantum entropically dynamic sense. The photons commingled, and an image appeared in the room as my software amplified the woman's neural interference patterns that were strongly indicated as the image of her son was clear. All was going as normal when there was a crash of thunder and simultaneous lightning strike. A power surge resulted and the holograph disappeared, and there was a smell of burning in the room. I felt a strange sensation overtake me. The woman did not seem to have noticed. She was still dreaming of her son. I had to stop the proceedings. Sorry guys, I need to check the equipment. If there was anything wrong with the system, I could not discover it. The disgruntled police chief was getting impatient, so was I. What's going on? John Sr. demanded. He stood up threateningly. I don't think he had even seen his son's image, though it had only been there for a few moments. I stepped back expecting a fist in the face. I had been staying with them, and he was suspicious of what we had been up to during my sojourn. His wife was woken from her dream by his outburst and was eerily aware of his suspicions, rose and tried without much enthusiasm to calm him. Okay. John was now placated, his shoulders drooped. Miranda had an eager glint in her eye. Is it all right to go on now, Prospero? I was dreaming of my son. It was wonderful to see him again. Don't worry about John, she gave me a resigned shrug, a small satisfied smile on her face. She seemed to be enjoying both our discomfitures. I decided just to go ahead with it. I'll start it up again. It should be safe. There's no obvious damage. I thought that even if there had been some corruption of the hard or software, I was sure that it wouldn't be harmful, because there was no real interface between the clients and the silent holographic images they produced. In the TV spectaculars, the images were provided with voices. It was a flim-flam man production indeed. I did a quick scan of the equipment with my monitor safety protocol, just in case. Everything appeared to be within normal parameters. It seems to be okay now. I'll get on with it. I indicated to the woman that she reseat herself and me her, and the man rejoined hands. I started the thing up again, and the wife again fell into a state of dreamy, mindful awareness. The image reappeared but started to waver, undulating in a way I had never before observed, as if inhaling the energy of the lightning burst, and then it actually talked. On its own. This was unheard of. I staggered, physically struck by the implications of this. I reeled about for a few moments. Are you okay? The wife was aware of my excited distress. Even in her trance-like state showed concern. But her husband, the police chief, was sadly immune to the process. He sat confused as I let go of his hand, which fell limply onto the table, and my excitement at his wife's talking holograph. I didn't notice his inert demeanor. As I was wearing an integrated eyepiece, I could access my software through my own neural net, and although I had no way to pick up his words as yet, I could see the harmonics of them on one of my virtual monitors. I was able to very quickly adapt a voice recognition program, and soon we could hear him speaking, albeit in a Stephen Hawking voice. Hi, Mom. I had learned she had given birth to him when she was just 17, the police chief sweeping her off her feet with his tales of gung-ho gallantry. She replied indistinctly, tearfully, happily. Son. Sorry, I can't be here in person. He was apologetic in an amused way. Oh. Jack, my little Jack. She turned to me. What's wrong with his voice? I can only give him a synthetic voice in the waking world. I pondered for a second. Do you have any recording of his voice, digital or analog? Either would be good. Why, yes, I can get them for you. Then your next visit will be with a son more like the son you remember. The woman got up, clearly wanting to touch to embrace her son. You can't do that here, Mom. I'm only the light of your mind, a quantum photonic being here. We can hug, as we've done many times in the dream time. She nodded and sat back in the chair, her hand folded serenely in her lap, as only a mother could. The room was silent, flowing with an almost physical expectation and emanation that I could only call entangled holographic entropic ectoplasm. I was taken aback because I had never encountered an interactive holograph before. This was not just paradigm shifting, but paradigm making stuff. Jack spoke again. What's the matter with Pa? We looked away from Jack to John. The husband sat open-mouthed, unseeing and unhearing. This was because perhaps he was too solipsistic, unable to shake of his sense of loss and resultant emptiness. This was not unusual, but the extremity of his reaction was. This was in my experience because there are few people who are completely indifferent to the taking of a life, as I knew this man to be, could not accept death as anything but an end, thus something alien, something unknown, and therefore dangerous. In some sense, the termination of a potential life was a deserved end merely because of superficial difference. This was what defined such people: superficiality and unaware ignorance. It was also that such people could not accept their own deaths in the same way as they treated others. I could see from his readings, the code of which was an open book to me, that he thought his life was a selected one, and only the few could look forward to some kind of life beyond death. In this way he was actually condemning himself to a solitary confinement of sorts, with minimal entanglement possibilities, just as qubit programmers had done for years. It was purblind insular beings such as him who had consigned our species to the status of universal museum exhibit. In an infinite glass case, all but a few of us. Suddenly he twitched and sat bolt upright. Oh, God, what's happening to me? A mass of tangled light appeared. I looked at my internal neural network monitors, and his measurements were going of the scale. John slumped back in his chair comatose. What's happening? The mother and son said in unison, clearly concerned, clearly very much worried for this man. Wait, I said, it's a massive neural eruption. Like a volcano of interference. It seems to be looping though. I'll get it sorted again. I had seen such reactions before, but never so severe. A mass of interference data had produced a continuously changing web of tangled strings of light which was dancing contortedly about the room. I tried to unredecohere the frequencies by using my preset program. The images slowly formed into a recognizable grid pattern, and a rainbow arched over us. The secret was tuning the observed image so the dynamic superposition between kinetic and potential energy was retained as probabilistic, otherwise the holograph would just be a decontextualized static single-shot photograph of a moment in non-existent eye-blink time from his neural net. I did not want his dynamic wave equilibrium to collapse, or it was lost. He may be lost. This was not just a matter of the program, but of my interaction with the program as well. I had never experienced such an amorphous mess before, and felt like I was losing the connection to this man's images, even losing connection with myself. Then I felt something entirely new sweep over me. I can help you. It was the dead soldier Jack, and he had appeared in my neural net computer. I was agog, confused and elated. I had never shared anyone's life outside of the dream world in this way. I had never met this guy in real life. His virtual persona was made up of his quantum entanglement with his mother. What is this? I thought, excited beyond metrics by the infinite probabilities opening out before me. I felt the entropic entanglements his mother had being taken up by my brain, new neurons and synapses being formed and recorded on my own internal and external processing machines. I was excited beyond belief. Seeing the kinetic potential, seeing the potential kinesis of this mind-boggling event shook me to the core. What the sweet fuck is going on? I jabbered. Calm down, he said. I can help you. Look. He drew me along a path, tunneling out of the secure quantum neural well I had been in, and opened out the possibilities beyond the model that I thought I controlled, but now saw it controlled me. He gathered the amorphous images streaming from his father for me and presented them to the program's image generation interface. It was a life and death, potential and kinetic energy information transformational experience. The holographs that were now clearly floating in the room were like a window into the police chief's life. I was so obvious why he was like he was. It was the removal of the balance between kinetic and potential energy from the complex equation of life, by taking it from others in an unthinking manner. I was now able to project such images using much the same methods as I had for my spectaculars, and saw on one of my monitors these images immediately repressed by the police chief, who sat in a not here state, as if his body had been evaluated of his being, a zombie maybe. Without the potential of life, there could be no kinetic life. This was perhaps why the man was close to the multiverse as he appeared to be. But to us, the mother, son, and me, a host of images of shooting unarmed people were projected into the room. Because of my data manipulation, the images were shown as sequential and fitting to our restricted waking experience, even though in quantum terms these things all happened at once, as they do in dreams. A scene emerged from the rainbow of a shabby village in a steamy jungle as ragged band of brother soldiers trudged in battle wearily. Their first concern was a clean supply of water and something to eat, preferable not poisoned. But one of the group was not like this. He was bright button fresh, eyes glinting, slavering like a predator. He was alert and ready to kill. He had his rifle ready for action and entered each building by a John Wayne-like kicking in of the rickety doors. Anyone he found he would immediately machine gun as a potential enemy, no matter whether they were man, woman, child, or animal. The rest of his platoon sat around smoking dope and watching his behavior with a glassy-eyed, detached air. It was as if they were not involved with this man's violence, as he killed indiscriminately, screaming in a manic manner, "USA! USA!" at each murderous trigger pull. Kill them all. The eyes of his victims that he had hung around his neck were swinging in time to the music of automatic gunfire. His murderous violence seemed to continue when he left the army, for we saw images of him involved in a vigilante group waylaying and disposing of people using Ku Klux Klan methods. The image we saw, he wore such a uniform, as a young man was hanged from a sour apple tree and set alight. "We are doing God's work," we heard his holograph hawking voice intone many times over as the images unwound. Always echoing around the room the refrain, kill them all. Then a different scene was shown. We saw a flashing of events as he was voted in as police chief because he would be strong with recalcitrant aliens. We also saw some strangely tender images of him courting his wife, oddly out of kilter with the rest of the violence that his mind contained, topped up daily by the media it seemed. His image was now seen patrolling the pedestrian empty streets in his car and used the same killing tactics if he came up against any alien behavior. He was trigger happy, and many died as a result due to them being different from him, too many for us to count. And many turned a blind eye, we saw too. And all because he lacked empathy. The images were so frightening, it's not really surprising he repressed them. And this repression had seemingly manifested itself in his physical presence with bloody consequences, and his peers allowed him to do this. He sat automaton blank, but his wife, her son, and I watched spellbound at the quickly flashing scenes, which, though they only lasted a few waking seconds, seemed to take up hours of time, for the images we saw also triggered a miasma of other interconnected conspiratorial imagery that we were aware of only indirectly. We were dumbfounded, for the police chief did not appear to have experienced any of this. He started as if awaking from a trance, and the images stopped as if they had been turned off. "This mumbo-jumbo hasn't worked," he said. "I can't see a thing." His wife tried to talk to him, but it was useless. He couldn't even see the image of his son. He was lost. All because he couldn't accept what he was and what he had done. It was clear that the images I had seen on the DreamNet of the demise of mankind was due to the limited collapsed dynamic wave equilibrium behaviors such unaware beings, trapped in a completely material world of their own making. He kept mumbling, kill them all. This sparked a lot of thought in me. The couple left. The wife promising to arrange another meeting, the husband after he had slowly recovered his daily mask, dismissing it all as hokum and hocus pocus. He told all his friends the same, and my client list dried up, my reputation in tatters due to the mainstream media's disavowal of my new methodology. But I was not concerned. I had more than enough to live on. It was the implications of this seance that haunted me, and now drove me. The lack of media attention was a boon which allowed me room to experiment with Miranda and Jack. Miranda was very concerned for her husband. "Was there anything I could do for John?" she pleaded one day. Jack was there too and showed the same concern of seeking redemption for his lost father. I wondered if there was some kind of salvation for this poor creature, and so for the many closed beings that were so tragically lost in their own self-importance, not realizing it was self-imposed impotence and ignorance. Our current waking logic would indicate either punishment or rehabilitation. This was an age-old dilemma, and I did not seek to unravel it. I thought that both processes would need to be applied in some as yet undivined way. The process of punishment would be the revealing, the realization of the destruction of the potential and kinetic energy dynamic balance that their behaviors had brought. For the next few weeks, I experimented further with the life-death dilemma, with Jack's post-life perspective entangling us all entropically in an expanding web that Emily described well. I discussed this matter at length with Miranda and her Jack, who had become my closest allies, because we had shared this moment of revelation. But my Dreamtime associates were also prevalent in forming the basis of a way to save the lost. For is it not so the lost guide the found? We decided to try and give the police chief physical evidence of what had just happened to see if he could be persuaded to admit to himself that his behavior was part of a conditioning that many had suffered from, and eternal recurrence of the lack of balance between the kinetic and potential, the real and the imaginary. To do this, the fundamental thought patterns of the man would need to be opened out. From the new/old sharing awareness that Jack had shown me in and outside myself, I was able to trace that the collapse of his wave equilibrium had occurred at no particular point, but was due to a set of paths traveled that form a synaptic web that was almost without any connection to the possibilities of sharing, of interacting. The only mechanisms his body and mind required to keep functioning were internalized ones, specters of illusional self-sufficiency combined with modern Western world social mores only made him more disconnected from what it was to be in a multiverse where to be was, as Jack had put it when talking about his new oneness within and without. See, I am, childhood and future are not growing less, supernumerous existence wells up in my heart. Which Jack said was a quote from Rilke, an Austro-Hungarian-born poet and Dreamtime visionary, who I had never heard of. I could not carry out the therapy at my place, so I was invited round to the Darwins for suppers that involved the local dignitaries, who took pleasure in John's dismissal of my work. I was able to work on John after creating a drinking man's friendship with him. He would drink and I would talk to him while his soberness was leaving him, so I was able to start unlocking the repressive doors in him. After a few months of our new therapy, John became aware of some of the hidden alleyways of his neural pathways. One morning, after new neurons and synapses had opened a bridge to his misdeeds, he came to his wife, who was in the shower crying profusely. He embraced her from behind, still wearing his nightwear. "I don't know what's happened to me, but I need help, I think." She turned and embraced him in return. "I've had some dreams that remind me of some things that I can't face. I have done some terrible things. What can I do?" We had discussed such things occurring, but never really believed it would happen. There, I understand she was tearful, realizing that her beloved may have a chance at some kind of redemption. He continued after explaining some of the conspiracies he had been involved in. "I must pay for what I have done." He did not want to go to the papers, but had the idea of giving himself up to the FBI, who as a third party would be able to action his accusations with some neutrality. Miranda thought that would be best. But of course the authorities did not want to listen, because it opened up many of those complicit in his crimes against humanity, which he now called them. When he talked the FBI in his confession, he did not go into any detail of why he was suddenly coming clean, save to say, "It was a revelatory hypnosis experience that I had given the magician that made him aware of his crimes." It was not long before the police chief disappeared, his case swiftly dealt with by sweeping it under the administrative carpet. During this whole period the authorities questioned me and his wife, but due to their completely blinkered thought patterns they could not see what had happened. So because of the insularity of those in power, they actually had no idea what was going on. Only with treatment would they. For they were all very sick beings. They, of course, thought everyone else was sick, but not them. We did not therefore consider any action when the inevitable disappearance of the police chief occurred. John had the feeling it was going to happen before it did. It's a shame I can't see you get all these bastards, if you can do it. But I guess it's kind of ironic that I will suffer the same fate as so many of my victims, he told all three of us when he was able to see his son. He was a changed man and met his fate with the cool dispassion of an aware being. He added almost as an afterthought, "Don't you go looking for me if I'm disappeared. Well, not too hard anyways, it'll only cause you problems with your magic spells to save us all." He was right, and we knew it. We made cursory attempts to look for him that the authorities would pick up on. But we were in contact with him all along, up until the moment of his death and after, thanks to our relationship with Jack, whose entangled being had access to the whole dreamtime of which we as living only had a partial access. All the attempts to get information from John were fruitless because he had the ability to a mindfulness that freed him completely from pain and distress. He could do this in a dreamlike state assorted by Jack his son, who he could see before his death without the aid of any device. Because of the hypnosis that I had supposedly given John, the authorities investigated my equipment to see if it had in some way brainwashed him into a confession. But as they thought of me as some kind of flimflam man, they decided before they arrived at my place they would find no evidence of anything underhand, so they didn't. They wouldn't have understood it even if they had found it, because the main ingredient was actually the empathic interaction between beings, a concept well beyond their ken. We soon realized in our communications that to try and impose this new way of thinking was impossible, as the powers that be would crush anything that would compromise their potency, which was in fact nothing but the power to destroy humanity. So we let the case die down, and managed to avoid problems by feeding the media with tales of how the police chief had been hypnotized by me to create a scandal for the purposes of self-publicity. This was lapped up by the right-wing media, who also ran extended lewd accounts of the police chief's wife and me, which we did not deny. We actually prompted the allegations that we had disposed of the police chief as a crime of passion. Some months later, after the press-feeding frenzy had fully sated itself, we felt able to discuss the future. At the insistence of the wife of the police chief and her son, who had by now become my real and dream lover and dead stepchild respectively, we decided to create a dreaming detective agency to follow these results through, to see what impact we could have in the small matter of saving humanity from self-destruction. With the help and of the guidance of Jack, I was able to see I was not the only one who was active in such a way in the dreamtime. In parallel universes, other teams picked up on my entanglement increase, which created an identifiable ripple in the dreamtime continuum and communicated new methodologies to me, which exposed a whole new world of corruption that was gradually released to the public, and those who had perpetrated such crimes, from no matter what time period, could not only be brought to justice, but also gain an awareness of who they were and what a deadly effect they were having on the future of humanity. So did we help them, the lost ones? The ones gone but not forgotten. The living lost ones we found maybe. Gave them solace, gave them a good death. That's all we are after all, magicians. Illusion is our business. Chapter 6. But we had become complacent. The authorities were aware of our connection to the stories of corruption and so had to look for ways of diffusing the implications of the revelations that were appearing on the internet. So they created a complete bogus case against me in regard of John's death. I had not been keeping tabs on these people, as I considered them blind, unthinking members of an outmoded way of life. But I had underestimated them. They were clinical in their corrupt practices. It was a surprise when they burst into my house that Friday the 13th morning, brandishing their guns and their desire to retain the status quo of which they were the creators. It was inevitable I would be sentenced to prison, as theatrical trial was conducted by a judge and jury of unaware American Dream adherents. The corrupt nature of the whole proceedings was evident to many, and an online appeal raised much-needed fund to challenge the ruling. As it was judged to be a cop killing, I was given a death sentence. However, I was able to appeal this sentence, which gave me time to reflect. During my enforced death row manacled sabbatical, all-seeing, I was able to investigate further the insights that my paranormal practices had given me. I was able to meet a dream interpreter as I traversed the paths of sleep, which also I realized were a gateway to a dimension of wordless open horizons. It was Emily who introduced her to me in her beautiful dream flower garden. As we walked, she pointed to a formidable figure of a woman sitting in our arbor seat. She beckoned to me. I turned to Emily, who saw I was intimidated and fearful of the aura of power that the lady exuded, nodded encouragingly, and guided me toward the seated sepulchral figure. I am Astrid Formosa. You have arrived with me because you have gained access to the dreamtime of Gem 1. Welcome. Remember, words will not avail you, they always fail you. Rely on yourself as you are, not your wordful residual self-image. I was thus, after much training, able to see the shape of a crystalline entity in these nomadic perambulations with her, which shone like a beacon from this mysterious dreamtime source. There I saw that there had been recent incursion into our dimension by an isolated one or Io from the all-seeing dream place that was within and without all. The world of words was revealed as a place of deception in this emergent tale. I saw then that my use of the untethered language of translational states found in the quantum seances that I had performed with Paul Dirac, and it was clearly a facet of what Astrid had named without naming Gem 1. Perhaps it was the crystalline source of power or a conduit of some kind for the dreamtime to become a possibility, an impossibility. She showed the work of Platonic weavers, and the realization came upon me of the quilted nature of waking and dreaming, how reversible they could be, made from diverse materials interwoven, and tangled to form a zone of warmth, homeliness, togetherness, and comfort. I was able to contact through Astrid, who stood at the nexus, her, the Delphic omphalos of many dreams, others. These others had accessed the powerful intertwining, entangling entropic of Gem 1 and shared their stories, their self-admitted lies. Astrid's thoughts echo loud and deep in my heart. As soon as you choose one word, you become part truth or untruth. You become a liar. Admit you are a liar and you become the truth, which becomes you. I thus embarked on a project in jail that I ironically called the Prospero Papers that would attempt to draw some of these facets together, so enhancing the chances of overcoming the rotten state of the word-controlled world we abide apart and apart in. I knew that this would probably result in my own disappearance from the waking world, but this no longer held any fear for me. Let them, kill them all, it was only themselves that were consigning to everlasting isolation. Gaining from this night-landed dreamtime journey to the eastern morning land of Aurora and my own western twilight land of the evening, I see theatrical backdrops of each continent being tainted by Algos and his disciples, who unknowingly have secured themselves a place in a purgatorial territory. It is a place of unawareness and foreboding. They know not what outcomes are theirs. The dream is hidden from these petty polarized demandist perpetrators and treacherous self-deluded word-drowned perpetuators, unseeing self-deception their only reward. Regardless of whether their play on words is a short-term act or not, they become enamored with the power seemingly engendered. But it is an empty power without any depth. They are the rapers, the discarded wrappers of what is left of their dreaming selves, floating in a polluted puddle of self-centered solipsistic loss. This gives me some solace, and is the legacy of Seer and Ward-In, the joint waking dreamer cleansers of Gem 1. However, the price is for the deadly Algosian disciples if these purveyors self-deception find themselves and are able to self-accuse, they self-recuse, and gain access by melding once again to the gemonic dreamtime, where all is, even though it just be once, and is never really cancelable. The blemish was caused because redemption was refused by the dreamers of Morphesia for Algos. The choice was not given, so Gem 1 became darkened with the dogmatic determinism of the dreamers, who had been finitely infatuated, so infected, ironically, with the closed power-hungry thoughts of Algos, which was no doubt one of his aimless aims, his endless ends. This is what Seer found when he became one with the lost Algos, and when they rejected themselves, then they became unnamed dynamid, no-named dream nomads. So by refusing and losing all hope, they found hope anew. But he was unsure that this was enough to save the wakers of his world. For as soon as he saw the blemish in Gem 1 start to recede, the Nameless One found himself awake again, wondering, questioning, but calm and fulfilled, perhaps now a stone taken into the stone as Formendo the changed endomorph, so one in Gem 1? This was clear to my dreaming multiself as it updated from the waking day-to-day multiverse visits of what were in effect holographic tropically entangled beings. I always came back refreshed from this immersion of all my selves. The entrance of an isolated one whose self had arisen in the realm of dreams, the land of Gem 1, Morphesia, was a special set of events that always sparked an unknowingly set of cause and effects that could never be traced by anyone. I saw this, was a part of this, as I was marched ceremoniously to the small room where a bed lay with white-coated men and I was connected up to life-measuring electronics. There was an audience. Miranda was there, I saw, clearly grief-stricken, but smiling knowingly. I soon found my informational energy departing and I became one with my dreamtime selves. There was pain but no fear, for I saw what this was: another act of the transition of being, a transition that many are denied because of their insular lostness, their central beings wandering Morphesia like zombies, a sad but inevitable blemish in the depths of Gem 1. So this parting was, though sweet and sorrowful, a final data transfer from this particularity which was of immense power and uncontained joy, which thrilled my gemonic multiself with its rare, aware, all-encompassing beauty, this having been once, never to be cancelled. Epilogue. I, Prospero, tempestuous poet, philosopher, writer, liar, have been allowed to see this, and now it can be seen as Morphesia, the diamond dream world, part of the Prospero papers, written in the wordless words of the Nameless One, which I have gleaned from the Dersh Arbiten dreaming that Astrid Formosa has allowed in her wondrous work. Those Algosians who fail to renounce themselves are found manacled manically, securely ensconced in their closed wombish, tombish, windowless, cold alabaster chambers of thoughtlessness and ignorance full of emptiness. It is baffling why such people, given a choice, would inhabit such plush, pathetic places rather than the open, gemonic, eternal beginner's comfort zone. The comfort zone of those theatrically dramatized chambers of maiden thought that were uncovered by that dreamer of dreamers, John Keats, leading us to dust paradisal promised land of negative capability. Unseek and thee shall unfind. I cannot help myself, and through the weird words of Gem 1, I will go now to unseek the Nameless One. For he is lost, just as we all are. In this I will lose myself in the lands of the morning, of the twilight and the night, in my endless, questioning, answerless quest for wordlessness. I travel now often with Emily, who encouraged my wordless words that you will find lurking laughingly in the Prospero papers, where all is open to the eye of the beholder. I am lost in this Prospero projection, so I have been ruminating in a conjugated transitional status, a Dionysian eternal recurrence undone. And so again, and again, and again I start finding myself not myself. Am I alive or am I dead? Do I wake or sleep?